Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion of Daisy Kenyon. I think it's a very interesting movie, and I look forward to discussing it with you all, and I especially look forward to discussing it with my colleague who suggested it, Lisa DeNight. Lisa, how are you this evening?
Doing very well. I'm bathed in sunlight, unlike Kenyon.
Right. And thank you for suggesting this film and for your terrific introduction. It gave us a lot of jumping off points, both to inform our viewing and to inform our discussion. So I look forward to going over it with you and with those folks joining us tonight. But before we do that, a little bit of business. Please keep your audio on mute until I call on you to ask your question or make your comment. I will know to call on you, hopefully, because you will please use the raise hand function within Zoom. And your name will appear to me, and I will call on folks in the order they have put their hands up or the order I've seen their hands go up. In addition, at that point, I should say, when I call on you, please unmute yourself. And then after you've asked your question or make your comment, please remute yourself so we don't have feedback and all that other stuff. In addition, the chat will be going within Zoom, and you should feel free to use that to introduce yourselves to us, to each other, to raise other interesting points. And our colleague Jill is in there, and she will send me a note with anything that Lisa and I need to talk about. That's not, sort of resolved by you all amongst yourselves in the chat. It's great to have all these different conversations about these interesting movies going. So we really appreciate that. We also, I think, oh yes, we would love to know if you're joining us from somewhere outside the greater Philadelphia area, please use the chat to introduce yourself, say hi, let us know where you're from. We typically have folks join us from all over the country and even sometimes from outside the country. So that's always neat for us to find. And with that, I believe we are ready to get started. Oh, wow, this is wonderful. We have someone who beat our normal first. There's two people who are almost always the first questioners, and we had someone beat both of them to the punch. So this is very exciting, and I hope she is sufficiently proud of herself. Kathleen, what is your question or comment? After that build-up, Kathleen, don't let me down. There you are.
Okay. Well, it's also, I'm going to have to let you down because it's Ron with Kathleen.
Oh, Ron, just kidding. Ron, you still get kudos. You still get kudos for being quick.
Okay. Well, this may be a minor point. Well, first of all, thank you for recommending the movie. We had never seen it before, and I never even heard of it before. And it was kind of well acted and interesting story. But I want to talk about maybe a minor point, but something that I've kind of like turned into a bit of a student of film, because I kind of researched this a little bit and there's a lot on it. Milk, drinking milk in that film. All three of the main characters were drinking milk. And I thought this is like product placement. And I just thought that was, to me, I thought it was interesting. It turns out that there's all kinds of articles about why characters drink milk in movies and the symbolism of milk in movies. And I was just wondering if you think that it was just basically product placement, or are they trying to use milk as a symbolism of innocence or strength?
Well, it's funny that you should mention this, because Lisa identified this as a point that if we were wagering folks, we would have wagered would come up at the top of the discussion, and she would be taking my money right now if we were wagering folks. So I know she has a couple of thoughts on this. So Lisa, why don't you please share them with us?
The milk came through. I knew it would. Thanks for asking the question. It is so omnipresent in this movie, very kind of strangely omnipresent. And I do have a number of thoughts. It sounds like you've probably done even more research than I on why characters just throughout the 30s and 40s and 50s drank milk on screen. But some background for some of my thoughts. Initially, the script was denied by the production code office for a couple of reasons. It was denied because it treated the sanctity of marriage so poorly in their estimation. And another reason that it was denied was because the initial script had a really heavy emphasis on the characters drinking, and the production code office just was not going to let that fly. So they scaled that significantly back in the script as it was filmed. That being said, I feel like Otto Preminger and the script writer probably almost inserted the milk almost as like an additional layer to say, like, okay, this is now a sub-in for Scotch and soda, because you have that kind of direct correlation where Henry Fonda's character walks into that restaurant and says Scotch and soda, okay, fine, milk. So there's this connection made there. And I think we could talk about like every single one of the instances of milk in this film, because each one has kind of additional layers of meaning. But broadly, I think milk equals alcohol in a lot of these circumstances, because they could not get away with putting so much emphasis on the characters drinking initially.
Yeah, you'll notice in the movie there's a lot of times people pour themselves a drink, but you don't see them drinking those drinks of alcohol all that often, if at all. As Lisa mentioned, the production code, which was the industry's self-censorship organ, wasn't just interested in making sure that objectionable words and images and behaviors got on screen. They wanted to also make sure that they were putting forth a what was viewed at the time to be a relatively moral outlook, or the characters tended to behave in moral ways, and if they didn't, to be punished most severely for not behaving in that way. And of course, nobody dies at the end of this movie, so no one's going to pay the ultimate price, so their behavior is sort of limited, which also partially explains how relatively chaste the affair between Dana Andrews and Joan Crawford is. But Ron, I would be curious if you said you did research. Did you find additional points about the use of milk?
Not for this particular movie, no. But I mean, in the sense they used it more. That I saw that it's often used as a symbol of innocence, youth, and strength. And then I saw an article in Esquire that talked about its use, like when you have a very sinister character drinking milk, like in Inglourious Basterds or No Country for Old Men. And it played a big role in the Mad Max Fury Road. So I was amazed how much there is on milk in film.
Well, and of course, there's the milk at the end of Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion that may or may not be Cary Grant's way of poisoning Joan Fontaine. So yeah, it definitely has a presence. And I think it's the sort of the irony of it as being, understandably thought of as a wholesome drink. But no, it was not a result of product placement. After all, there wasn't any sort of label on those bottles, so that wouldn't have done much good for any particular brand or state dairy association. Let's see. David, you have a question or comment?
Yes, being beaten out today was just amazing. However she did that. I'm going to put a quick plug in before I make my comments. Our family was over at Bryn Mawr Film Institute this weekend. We rented one of your studios for a family party, and the staff was amazing. You get to pick your own film. It was just an extra fun part of our being part of the Bryn Mawr Film family. And thank you for being there.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that, David. And I'm glad you all had such a wonderful experience. And I'm glad it was a great private rental for you and your family. In addition to being open for regular movies, we do have those rentals available at reasonable rates, especially for members. So I'm glad you took advantage of that and enjoed it. Thanks for letting us know.
We watched History of the World Part 1, and it was just so much fun for our family.
And there's $100 included in food from the concessions. So it's really very worthwhile.
Good.
So now that we've done your promo for you, let me make a few comments and observations. One was partially not only does the milk play this role, but Janice and I both observed that as the film went on, the so-called evil influences increased. The smoking in the first half of the film, if my recollection is correct, was non-existent. And then almost as I said to Janice, gee, we haven't seen smoking yet. Some cigarettes get lit. The liquor, as you described, is really very controlled until the meeting of the three of them, where not only is there liquor, but she orders the second one before the first one is touched. Sort of a rolling forward and building of that. Another observation: some people refer to film noir. Refer to film noir with lists without this film, and yet it seemed to me it was really in that genre. One of you may decide to discuss. You've heard me talk about music before, and if I observed correctly, Dan had basically no sound background, no music, nothing that brought him in. And it was, I'm sure, not an omission. It was intentional. His character had so many flaws, and you kept hoping, or I kept hoping or thinking that maybe they would be redeemed. And at the end, I really believe they were not. And as Dan was going down and Daisy was growing. And I sort of like the idea, even though it's already a week and a half after Mother's Day, that you had a women's strength issue where I think she really does, develop a certain amount of strength as she's going through this. And that one horrible scene with Dan basically attacking her, if she had not been as strong, and if the movies would have allowed it, which they didn't, that would have turned into a rape scene. And I just, I felt so horrible for her character and so mad at Dan. I really felt myself being enraged. So I gave you plenty if you want to talk about it. If not, we'll move on. But thank you again. A movie we have never seen before.
Well, thank you for that, David. You brought up a lot of things, and you gave me an opportunity to say something I think is important to say toward the beginning of the discussion, because we don't have that many hands raised, and I think that part of the reason that might be the case is that this is a challenging movie, and it can be a confusing movie, and I think particularly if you don't have the experience with the genre that it most closely resembles, which isn't film noir, but the woman's picture, you don't understand why it is in some ways a very bold and almost from an industry perspective subversive movie. And that is because this is a movie that I think can best be described as a withholding movie about withholding people. Now, I think we all know what I probably mean more or less when I say withholding people, but in terms of a withholding movie, something you said, David, you talked about the Dana Andrews character not really having any music accompanying him. This movie, I think movie music is something that's come up a lot in these discussions, and particularly movies in the 40s and 50s. Oftentimes people will say they feel that they have too much music or the music is too heavy-handed. I don't think anyone can say that about this movie. In fact, this movie has far less music than is probably the industry standard at the time, but is certainly far less than the typical melodrama. There are a lot of ways this movie, in some ways, this movie was marketed as a melodrama or a woman's film, as Lisa mentioned in her introduction. It's identified that most broadly. It has, just like, Stella Dallas and pick other movies of that genre, has a woman's name as its title, but it diverges. It really is a very, very different version of that sort of story of this genre than audiences would have expected, which probably had something to do with its underwhelming box office. And then the industry would have expected. And Otto Preminger is a filmmaker who is known for being as Lisa mentioned in introduction, more sort of subdued, low-key, understated. One could almost say that, particularly in some of his other films, more famous films like Anatomy of a Murder, where characters are really asking to be, he's not a judgmental filmmaker. And if you think about melodrama, it is typically all about judging characters, and it is all about letting you know how, as a viewer, how you should feel at that moment, hence the music and often the complaints about the heavy-handed nature of the music. This movie doesn't do that at all. And that is what is so interesting about it, what can be so challenging about it, but what I think makes it so ripe for discussion. But I have been talking for several minutes here. I want to give Lisa a chance to respond to whichever of David's interesting comments she would care to. So Lisa.
No, I really appreciated that kind of reorienting of the or foundational place setting of the conversation, Andrew. That was, I think, very helpful for the ongoing discussion. David, I really loved a lot of your thoughts. The kind of evil influences appearing more and more. That's honestly something that I didn't quite realize. I always lose track of her dog. Like that's one of the through lines in the film. Like the dog is just very present in the first half, but then is nowhere to be found in the second half. But I do think you're right that the need to kind of drink or dull with other vices gets stronger as the destabilizing effect of trying to find love gets even stronger. One thing that I would like to kind of build off of what Andrew said and connect back to a comment you made. Something you said was interesting to me, how you didn't think that, maybe you were specifically speaking about Dan, but you didn't think that characters were redeemed at the end. And
I was only referring to Dan in that particular thought process.
Okay, and that to me that is still interesting, because as Andrew was saying, there's so much kind of off kilter about this film from a typical melodrama, and even kind of thinking about, well, should a character be redeemed within the arc of a movie, I think is something that is not a concern of Preminger here. The way that he treats, or the way that he develops characterization is just so like fundamentally different than most of the other movies coming out in the same year. Typically, I think in a women's picture or a melodrama, we would kind of learn everything we need to know about someone in the first few minutes. Melodrama is kind of trafficked in stereotypes for a reason. And here in Daisy Kenyon, it's this emotional roller coaster of learning different nuances about someone's personality, and Dan seems just thoroughly awful for most of this movie, but there are no villains in this film. They're just complicated people, and I don't think anyone is redeemed or not redeemed at the end. We know a little bit more about them and have seen their troubles and in some cases successes. So it's just a very interesting approach to characterization that this film has, and something that to me is just incredibly modern and out of step with what else was going on in 1940s Hollywood.
I think that if we think about, building on what Lisa just said, if we think about melodrama, we are typically treated to a good deal more moments of the characters by themselves where they can quote unquote reveal themselves to the audience, the viewer, than this film has. And this movie doesn't lay out what these characters' sorts of, backgrounds, motivations, deals are. It lets us know that they're complicated. It lets us know that they're troubled by things. And when it does reveal a specific element, it does so matter-of-factly, almost almost to the point that it's funny. When Henry Fonda says his wife, when we learn Henry Fonda's wife is dead, we learn that with his back to the camera as he's walking away from us to open the door for them to leave, right? It's just sort of, oh, yeah, by the way. The whole thing with Dana Andrews deciding to give up, or at least set aside or be distracted from his corporate work to help the Japanese American soldier whose family farm was taken. We get a little introduction to that, but we don't actually get to see the car ride where his character is supposedly so affected by the story, by the case, that he decides to take it on at some risk to his standing, at least with his father-in-law. So these things that would or could give us those emotional, personal toeholds are almost sort of, I don't know what the word is, almost sort of like disdainfully or spitefully shrugged off or pushed to the corners, and because this movie isn't interested in telling a story the way Hollywood typically tells these stories. It is interested in giving less to the audience and demanding more from them. And it is interested in trying to present these characters much more in the way we would encounter them if we encountered actual people than if we encountered characters in a movie. Now, that's not necessarily the best strategy, right? If you think about, a lot of times people talk about screenplays and they say, oh, the dialogue was so realistic. But if you stopped and read the screenplay, you would realize it's not realistic. It gives the impression of being realistic, but it's not actually realistic. We don't, very often, efforts toward realism in narrative feature films can be disappointing. And maybe this was disappointing. And maybe it was for people who were expecting a sort of conventional Joan Crawford melodrama, such as the other one that came out that year, Possessed, which is much more right down Broadway in that regard. But this movie's Preminger and this movie they're doing what it's doing on purpose. They're trying to tell the story in a different way. And I think it's a more interesting way, in part because it's such a divergence from the standard approach. Gene, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi guys. Happy to accept the bronze medal, getting my question tonight. I have a confession to make. I didn't get to finish the movie. I set aside time to watch it, and that got sabotaged. But I still have a general, very simple comment to make that I wanted to get in, and that was simply that I was really impressed with Joan Crawford's performance, and it was not as theatrical or melodramatic as I think I'm used to seeing her. It felt a little bit more subdued or more naturalistic, and so I look forward to finishing the movie because she really stood out for me in that way, in a way I don't remember seeing her before. And that's all I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that is for the reasons that I had just spent 45 minutes talking about before I asked you to make your comment. But I also think it has to do with where she is in her career and, her age. And as someone who is a number of years past her age at this time, which I think was 42, she was considered by Hollywood to be a bit long in the tooth for a role like this. And to be fair, the character in the novel's in her early 30s, but you noticed a lot of shadow, and that's something that David mentioned that we didn't get back to, the film noir look. Part of that was a function of trying to hide her relative age. And while I don't think she altered her acting style because she was afraid she would appear to be in her 40s, I can't help but wonder if the efforts that were being made to sort of obscure her age might have also led her to be a bit more subdued. But I think that the far more important aspect of that is Preminger's direction and what they were all trying to do in telling this story. Lisa.
Yeah, Preminger definitely worked with Joan Crawford to get her performance a little bit more subdued, and it really does show. I think I agree with you. This is the most subdued performance of hers I've ever seen. There were even there's a good commentary on the DVD if anyone is able to check it out. But the film historian on the commentary was talking about how Preminger would give her, I don't know, some tissues, like pull that scene where she's looking for something in her purse. That was Preminger, like, hey, distract yourself from your acting and look through your purse or something. So there were definitely strides made by Preminger to tone down her performance. But I mean, all things considered, from everything I've read and heard, it was an extremely professional shoot. Everyone just showed up and did their work, and people were collegial, and that was that. So it worked all around, but the performance she gives is really wonderful. So I'm glad you appreciated that, and you'll have to check out the ending when you get a.
I will, for sure. Thanks. I'll watch it all from the start just to make it work.
Well, that's good, because hopefully there'll be some more elements you can pick up on after what you've heard in the discussion tonight.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to go back to David's point about noir, and Lisa, this is something that you should definitely disagree with me if you disagree, but I don't think this is really a noir at all. In fact, I think it's so much not a noir that when Dana Andrews says to his wife, well, basically, I never thought before that you were worth killing, which implies that at that moment he was really considering it. You sort of think, like, have I just stepped into a different movie? And I think that, this is something that comes up by this time in the 1940s, and it was an issue that came up. It's a much closer call than Mildred Pierce, the other sort of movie where Joan Crawford plays the title character, who's a harried professional, and there's a love triangle that has noir elements. I think that movie has more noir elements, in part because one of the characters is very much a femme fatale, and it has the story structure of a death and the bookend. Sort of, it's non-linear and all that. This movie doesn't really have any hallmarks of noir, with the exception of some of the lighting. And I think that bit of a stylistic flourish, I sort of equate that to, in the 90s and early 2000s, sort of like ridiculously rapid cutting, sort of so-called MTV editing. It's a mode that the industry is into at that time. It's not done because the film specifically calls for it. And I think here it has a bit of the purpose of trying to, they're nervous about Crawford appearing too old, but so there's some of the shadows for some of that, but mostly I think it's just a sort of flourish of the style of the time, and it really doesn't indicate this film being a film noir in any substantive sense. Would you agree with that, Lisa?
I would agree. I do think that the cinematography is kind of leaning on the same emotional and thematic uses of lighting and cinematography as in film noir. I think of that scene where Henry Fonda has just seen Dan leave, or Peter has seen Dan leave, and then sits down in the stairwell, just really kind of depressed and upset. And the shadows are just so heavy over him at that point. And I think that the lighting is kind of specifically used to get across this atmosphere of uncertainty and ambiguity, post World War II. All that being said, I agree with you entirely. I think that was just kind of the mode of the day that people enjoyed using, because so many movies were about the uncertainty of post-World War II America. But no, I do not think it is film noir. And I think I said as much in my intro. It's erroneously named a film noir from time to time.
I mean, I've seen lists of films noir that has Casablanca on it. I mean, they're just, sometimes it depends who's making the list. So, I mean, let alone back when there were video stores, if you walk down the supposed film noir aisle in a video store, you could sometimes get a good chuckle there. Let's see, Amy and Jeff, do you have a question or comment?
Hi, my apologies for the delay.
No problem.
One question, and then I have an observation. My question is, I noted that the composer of the music was the same as a prior Otto Preminger film, and unfortunately, I can't remember which one it was, but same effect on me as I watched the film. The observation I have is, now I'm not a lawyer, but I spent a lot of time with lawyers, and it was interesting as the film progressed. Maybe this was just the novel, but he was the center of the universe, at least in my opinion. He was calling everybody. He had a nickname for everybody in the office, and the office revolved around him. At least that was my impression as I watched the film. Once he agreed to take on a trial, my sense was all the mentions that, and I may have missed it, so please correct me, but all the mentions of his work up until he took on that Japanese client, it seemed like a lot of them were negotiations, a lot of them were regulations. Taking on the trial means he was taking on a new risk. And it was interesting that he would go to trial on something like that and take a risk for his career. But then subsequent, after that, he ended up, it showed a divorce trial. Now, to my knowledge, I don't think too many divorces went before a jury. Usually it was before a judge. So again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm very familiar with family law, but maybe not back in 1947. So it was just kind of interesting to see the snowball effect. He was the center of the universe. He had a nickname for everybody. And all of a sudden, as he went through the trial and his own trial, how he just sort of, as you said earlier, unraveled. But it was also one last comment. It was kind of interesting from a standpoint of how they presented the kids and their interest in this divorce trial, because I'm not so certain whether that would have happened back then. So just, I'll stop there. It was very interesting to me.
Well, thanks for those comments. I think your point about Dan's sort of career trajectory is a very interesting one, because it brings up something that occurred to me and probably to some of you, which is that, this movie has a lot of plot in it, and it has a lot of things happening to, not a lot of insight into, not direct insight into characters, but a lot of things happening to characters. And if you sort of said everything that happens to Dan, or every change in his life over the course of this movie, that could have been a movie by itself. And that isn't something that Hollywood typically did at that time for multiple characters in a story. I mean, the movie's called Daisy Kenyon, but in many ways, the more dynamic life changes happen to Dan. And, we saw Dana Andrews in another male melodrama about a year ago, Best Years of Our Lives. And it's interesting because this movie called Daisy Kenyon, starring Joan Crawford, ostensibly about her character, doesn't start with her. It starts with Dana Andrews. It starts with him in that scene in the cab and pulling up to her place. A place, by the way, that I think I assumed anyway, I won't speak for others, I assumed was his home with the woman, one of the women who was inside it. Of course, that's another thing that we learn very subtly, offhandedly. Right, several minutes into their conversation in the beginning of the film, we learn that he has a wife and kids somewhere else, just sort of offhandedly. So I mention this because the trial that he decides to handle could have been a movie unto itself, right? The sort of professional fall you know, you often see that in movies, right? You see a sort of professional fall and some personal growth. And the implication or the suggestion is that those two things can't coexist. You can't be the lawyer at the white shoe firm that you married into, who goes to the Stork Club and calls everybody honey bunch, and be a decent human being. So if you decide to do something to become a more decent human being, then that stuff has to go away. And I think it's very interesting, and Emily and Ron brought this up in the chat, that there's a sort of interesting undercurrent about class in this movie too, which I won't get into here because it's a whole other topic, and we can talk about it in a bit. But I think that I can't speak to the specific sort of legal rules and procedures. I will grant you that from my recollection, which I will certainly say isn't, you know, encyclopedic, it's the biggest folk, other than a movie that of this era that's about divorce or that's expressly about a couple breaking up. This is the most detailed and extensive depiction of divorce proceedings I've seen in a movie from the era. And by the way, you would expect that some element of that courtroom drama to be the climax of the film. But in a way, those proceedings are entirely anticlimactic, which is just another way that this movie is withholding. Lisa, your thoughts?
Dan is low-key my most intriguing character in this film. I think what makes this film so special is that all three of the leads are on equal playing field when it comes to intrigue about their personalities and their, you know, emotional drivers, their arc. Each one is more developed and interesting and compelling than it has any right to be in this sort of film, I think. And that being said, Dan is kind of my personal favorite to watch the arc of, for exactly the reasons that you and Andrew were just talking about. I love how, and Andrew said this earlier, we don't see that cab ride that, you know, this ACLU, or I forget the organization, the nonprofit that this man comes to him from to try to take this case on. We don't see that conversation. What we see is Dan saying to Daisy Kenyon, hey, you're gonna love me, I'm taking this case that like is gonna, you know, really be a progressive good. And so you kind of get the idea that maybe he's taking it as kind of a, well, let me be good for once and see how Daisy likes me, or, you know, it's very self-serving initially. You get the distinct feeling that it is very self-serving, or he just kind of wants to be a needle in his father-in-law's side. But as the film progresses, he has a deep vested interest in this case, and it goes beyond the loss of control of him losing it. Like he really is quite invested, to the point that I and we could talk about this forever, but I love how the film kind of delineates spaces, and walking in and out of doors is just a constant visual motif in this film. And think about the law office that Dan belongs to with his father-in-law. He passes through like what feels like 17 doors to get to his office, and
it's like the opening of Get Smart.
Yeah, there's just one door after another, and the law office that he takes at the end of the film is quite the opposite. It's open. There are, you know, windows everywhere. There's his desk, and then you can see the door that people can walk in and immediately get at him. And you really do get the sense that even though this guy is kind of horrible for other reasons, he has found some personal growth and changed his priorities. And some of that is, again, self-serving, because he is now willing to, you know, jettison his kids to his wife, who, that's a whole other conversation. Again, no one's purely a villain or a victim, but his wife is taking frustration out on her children in a way that this film deals with pretty explicitly. And so yes, there is a bit of self-servingness with St. Andrews realizing, okay, I do want Daisy, but you know, I have these kids. So I'm kind of yammering on at this point, but I love the trajectory of all of these characters. And again, no one is redeemed at the end, certainly not Dan. And I think that Peter and Daisy are still very flawed as well. But they all have such interesting trajectories and real trajectories, like how people would actually react to these sets of circumstances in real life. So that's what I have to say about that. And then very quickly, I think the composer also did the music for Laura, which is another Preminger film, which you asked about at the top. Do you have anything else to add, Andrew?
All of these characters are trapped, right? Dana Andrews is trapped by, he seems to enjoy the trappings that he has, but we eventually come to realize, even if he doesn't, that he feels trapped by the expectations of the type of life he's supposed to live, of what he's supposed to provide for his family, of how he's supposed to represent himself to his father-in-law. And your very well made point about the differences between the two law offices once he's on his own, you know, in retrospect makes us realize that. Daisy Kenyon is trapped by being stuck in this sort of second fiddle relationship with this man, and Peter is trapped by, you know, the horrors he observed or experienced or took part in during his military service and the memory of his dead wife. But unlike most movies where the characters are trapped, one, it's often not all three main characters who are trapped, but two, they almost always realize it at some point and articulate it. Or there's a moment in the film where it becomes made crystal clear to all of us, if not to the character himself or herself, that they're trapped. That doesn't happen here, right? I think they gradually realize it, and to varying degrees, they sort of, you know, work their way free, but there's no sort of, you know, moment where they realize they've thrown off some sort of shackle. And that's just that's not how the world usually works, and that's not how, you know, people typically live their lives, but that is how movies work, and particularly how melodramas work, except this one. Let's see, Hirsh's, Barbara and Richard, or Richard, do you have a comment or question?
Hi, Andrew. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for the suggestion on the film. Actually, Barbara had a whole bunch of questions, but you just covered all of them. So I took her hand to ask a couple of other questions. A couple of things I'd be interested if you might reflect on is the contrast between the two male and the two female characters. One of the things I noticed was it seems sort of implicit that the Dan character didn't serve in the army. I can't point to something specific in the film that says that, but that's already a contrast with the two of them. I already posted in the chat my sense that Daisy seemed to be more maternally concerned about Dan's children than the mom seemed to be. So like those couple of issues about the contrast between the two male and the two females. And then the larger question, I appreciated Lisa's warning that this isn't a film noir. But I'm also very aware of the time in which it appears after the war. And it seems to me to be almost an overture to what will become so many of the profiles of the disrupted ideal of family in film noir, starting in the 50s. And I can't figure out where there's a healthy family in this system. You know, one person's a widower, someone else is having an affair. And at the end of the film, I don't have the sense that Daisy and Peter are going to be married 5 years from now or raise kids or whatever it is. So it feels to me that the movie hovers in between the kind of family ideal of the movies of the late 30s and 40s, like Meet Me in St. Louis or even Oklahoma, and what emerges in the 50s, which is just these, you know, awful characters who are just abusing each other right and left and disregarding the family, you know, kind of altogether. And just to finish this off, because I posted this in the chat also, I was wondering if the end of the film, in your opinion, is a flex of the code that Joan Crawford, having left the life of adultery to be apparently loyal to Peter, is allowed to accept him back as her husband.
I think it's interesting. I think your comments about family and the depictions of family are so interesting and could be the topic of like a semester-long course. But I will share a few thoughts on them. First, I think it's interesting that the two movies that you mentioned as sort of relatively wholesome depictions of intact families were period movies, Oklahoma and Meet Me in St. Louis, because Hollywood is interested in showing happy families. But during the war, at least in the case of Meet Me in St. Louis, they had the good sense not to try and suggest that there are lots of currently intact and happy families at that time. I think the myth of the happy nuclear American family isn't only a concern of film noir, it's a concern of all of Hollywood. And I think part of it is that that's what filmmakers want to talk about. I think part of it is that the industry gets increasingly bold as the 40s turn to the 50s, and is increasingly rewarded for their social problem films. And perhaps more importantly, it draws a sharp distinction from television. Television depicts those families that way. So the movies are going to differentiate themselves from what they view as competition in that era by showing families the other way. And it's not just film noir. I mean, it's Rebel Without a Cause. It's a host of movies. It's a problem pretty much across the board, except for the sort of the lightest of frivolous comedies. But even then, you sort of have those movies where it's a blended family, or there's something odd, Cheaper by the Dozen, things like that into the 50s. So I think that is not something we can think about as solely belonging to noir, though in fact, noir in the 40s is usually not about people with children, because the people are behaving so badly that the code wouldn't have allowed them to subject children to the sorts of things, the shootings, the poisonings, the murder plots, the drownings in pools, etc. So, and in fact, it was something of a departure that children were so involved in a divorce in a Hollywood movie at the time. They would often find ways to have a dog substitute for the object of the custody struggle, so people didn't have to see children being put through this. But this is after the war, so they can be a little more gritty about it. Lisa, any thoughts on what Richard brought up?
Richard, those were all amazing comments, and I'm going to be chewing on them for a long time. Yeah, I mean, I think just generally in Hollywood post World War II, you just see time and time again movies where the world has lost its moral grounding, and whether that's in a melodrama or a film noir or any number of pictures, that there are kind of ramifications for that new world where there are no longer black and white choices. Everything's kind of in this moral gray zone. And I think your comments about how there's no nuclear family unit or strong family unit in this is interesting. I don't know if at least in my opinion, if Preminger is really making some sort of strong statement about the inability of a nuclear family to exist. I just kind of see this panorama of human experience where something like adultery is shown very clearly as emotionally unfulfilling and really kind of cruel, but there's no judgment because people do it all the time. It's just a part of this panorama of human relationships that this film is kind of giving us. And I really appreciate that in going down that road, Preminger doesn't just use kids as props. Like these kids they have personalities, they have they are like truly being abused by what is going on between their parents. They're being hurt in kind of real, potentially life-scarring ways. And Preminger's clear-eyed focus on that as a part of everything else in this stew is really just unique, I think, for this this period. Go ahead.
No, and I was going to say that, I've been thinking about this while you were just saying that part, and I was thinking about it during Richard's remarks, and I want to sort of plant a flag in defense of Lucille as a mother, not in defense of slapping your kids so hard they have permanent ear damage, not in defense of slapping your kids at all. But I think Lucille is put in a terrible position, right? Because she has this nice guy who spoils the daughters, both in terms of permissiveness and taking them to the store club and buying them things, who breezes in 1 or 2 nights a week, gets to play the good, nice, fun guy, and then is off, and she's got to hold down the fort. And I remember my sister, when she was a teenager, we did not have 2 teenage girls in the house at the same time, but I know that teenage girls and their mothers tend to have especially challenging interactions, or at least they can. And that seemed to be the case with this family. And not only was he not helping it, he was making it worse. And so the comments that Daisy seemed more concerned about the daughters than their mother did, I don't really accept. I think Daisy has the luxury of judging from the outside and not having to ever have the rubber meet the road in terms of raising the girls. And I think that, Dan can come to Daisy and complain about how Lucille's acting, and Lucille needs to be better. But Lucille's also in a no-win situation that is almost entirely the result of Dan living his life and having his career the way he does.
You said that so well, because I wanted to make that connection between Lucille and Daisy. And I think your comments about the key difference is that Daisy has the luxury of looking in from the outside in terms of the kids. That I think that's a great point. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is your question about the end, which is a fascinating question. And to be honest, something that I kind of wrestle with as many times as I've seen this movie. I still don't know my total feelings on this end. On one hand, I do think that there is some sort of production codey haze going on here at the end where, yeah, she has to end up with someone. I mean, Joan Crawford, I think right before this movie, or before Mildred Pierce, I think, was labeled box office poison. And I think you can't, you can be out of Preminger and you can push the envelope a lot in making a really strange movie, but you can't have your main actress not end up with a guy. At least that's my take. But I do. So personally, I think maybe she's better off without either of them. But at the same time, I think it all comes back to each one of us has to consider, okay, well, what does Daisy want? Like, Daisy doesn't really know what she wants, but we can all try to think about what she wants as well. I see Andrew wants to disagree with me on that, but I think that Daisy just wants to not be taken for granted. I think she wants to have companionship, pleasant, fun companionship, keep on doing her awesome career, excelling with that, having her friend Angelus to hang out with, and she wants to not be taken for granted. And I think Peter fulfills that. It almost makes me think of like the end of Two Women, or Two Lovers, excuse me, which I know you guys discussed a couple weeks back. And you know, sometimes you just want a person who's gonna like you and maybe love you. And that's what I think I get out of the end. And I my final thought on this, I also love, even though I have complicated feelings about whether or not Daisy should just go with either one of these or scrap it all and start anew, I really love the detail of Peter coming back in after sending Dan on his way, and Daisy is pouring 2 shots of whiskey. She already has out the 2 glasses and she's pouring the shots. And this is a callback to, of course, when Peter poured the 2 shots quietly after she told him she loved him. So there are pros and cons for me personally when I think about the end. And ultimately I come down on being okay with it for emotional reasons, regardless of what the production code had to say about it.
I do agree that there was probably some code, but probably more importantly, just general sort of commercial and an industry pressure for her to end up with someone, right? I do think that's a consideration. That being said, I think that there's a lot that suggested that Peter was a good fit for her. He didn't keep her sort of, she wasn't his second place. At least once he sort of sobered up and got his mind right, she wasn't his second place. He seemed to, appreciate that she had a career and want to facilitate her. That cabin seemed to be as much a good place for her to do her work as for him to do his. They seemed to have similar interests. They seemed to, she seemed as excited about moving to the Cape as he was. The one thing that was missing was, does he actually want to be with her? Does the man who seemed to forget to call her for a follow-up date, and who seemed to be very laid back and almost sort of nonchalant about how this was all going to shake out, that seems to be the missing thing. Is he willing to actively make an effort to be with her? But she realizes what we realize the moment Peter puts Dan in the cab, which is that Peter's been planning this all along. Peter knew how things were going to shake out. Peter wasn't withdrawing because he didn't want to argue or he wasn't interested in her enough to fight for her or what have you. He was withdrawing when we saw him withdraw because he was reasonably confident that the 2 of them would either alienate each other or figure out that they shouldn't be together. And we know that because toward the end in the cabin, he says to them, you 2 have a lot to learn about tactics. And she realizes it because she's pouring 2 glasses of whiskey, not 1. She knows he's coming back in. She's not surprised. So the key piece that seemed to be missing, which was, is he actually interested in her and wanting to have a long-term relationship with her? That gets answered, at least to her satisfaction, if not to ours, at the end there. So I think it's a bit more than the fact that there's got to be a couple formed at the end of this thing. I think it's a bit more than that. Let's see, Diane, you had a question or comment.
So it's interesting that you're focused on the end about Daisy and Peter. I read that the production code folks put some pressure on Preminger to make sure that Dan and Lucille got back together. And obviously Preminger didn't have to follow that, but that's what the code people really wanted to see happen. And I'm also glad that you both decided to come to Lucille's defense to some degree, because I agree that although she wasn't a particularly effective mother, at least the parts that we saw, she was in an impossible situation with a husband who just wasn't supportive, and yeah, I don't think it's quite fair to blame her completely. But just two quick things. And one is the auto accident. I kind of thought that was a weak spot, because here's this car that rolls over, and of course there's no seatbelt, and yet she walks out of this car shaken up, and now she knows what she wants, what she doesn't want. I don't know, that just seemed a little melodramatic, and maybe a little unbelievable. And I guess the last comment I want to make is that, and I think Lisa said this in her introduction, about the social issues that were brought up in this movie, the PTSD that Peter has. You know, he's just really messed up after coming back from the war, and the fact that Diane is going to defend this Japanese American against land that was taken from him. And you've got a woman in Daisy who has a career. I mean, I found those things pretty fascinating in a film made in 1947. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. There's a lot packed in there. And you know, I mean, we'd seen PTSD the year before in Best Years of Our Lives, but it was still, you know, a relatively new, and bold is too strong, but certainly thoughtful element to include. And yeah, I mean, that's sort of, you know, what I was trying to get at before. I mean, I said this movie's so withholding. I mean, Preminger takes basically sort of three elements that in the very recent past, or in the case of the law case, probably moving forward, any one of them would have been the subject of the whole movie. I mean, Mildred Pierce is all about a woman trying to have her career and her personal life. And Daisy's got that part settled if she can just find a decent guy, right? And you know, the PTSD was a major element of Best Years of Our Lives the year before. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. These are really rich people, rich characters. And that's what's so interesting. But the movie doesn't seem to get as much mileage out of any of it as it could. But that's Preminger's not interested in melodramatic or even really dramatic mileage. And he's not as interested in plot as a lot of movies of Hollywood in general are, right? He's much more interested in these characters, but not sort of spoon feeding us the characters and sort of sketching the portrait, and then, you know, seeing how the players, you know, interact with each other, and what we as viewers get out of it. Lisa.
Diane, to talk about your inability to fully accept the car crash, I'm kind of with you on that, and that is the one. No, I guess there are maybe a handful of swells of this score where we get, you know, the melodrama. You know, usually Preminger is kind of working against melodrama, or kind of leveraging melodrama to fit his aims with characterization. Here, you just get this like crescendoing musical score and this ridiculous rollover. But that being, and it is kind of the climax of the film. This is the you know, epoch of the emotion there. But that being said, I truly love the shot that follows that crash, where we see Daisy stumbling out of the car. And I feel like we haven't spoken enough about just how amazing Preminger's camera is in this film, and kind of delineating space, because the camera just pulls back slowly and reveals all of this space around Daisy, as she is kind of realizing that she has this emotional and kind of thematic space to make decisions and think about what she does want moving forward. So I love the shot that follows it, even if I'm not totally on board for it, that particular car crash. So with you, with a caveat on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that I agree with the criticism of it, but I think they need to figure out a way to give her some time apart, basically, but also time apart where she can't leave the cabin because she has to go back to sort it out with the guys. So it's inelegant to say the least. But I also agree with you about the shot after. That almost makes it worth it, right? Let's see. Liz, you have a question or comment?
Hi. I was wondering, on yet another level, the Henry Fonda character was described as moody, quiet, and withholding in something I read, and we could all see that. But Henry Fonda, in everything I've read about him, could also be described by those three words. I wonder what attracted him, if playing a character close to home attracted him, or whether he didn't have any self-insight at all. And also Dana Andrews was an alcoholic. So I wondered, you know, those many scenes with milk or liquor or whatever. That was one comment I had. And a second comment that I had was, I looked up the author of the book. Her name is Elizabeth Janeway. And she early on wrote about families and such, but by the time the 60s and 70s came along, she was into feminism. She was a famous feminist. She was buds with Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug, and I thought that was kind of interesting too. That is
interesting. Thank you for mentioning that. I would also say that you know, I think that for the 1940s, Daisy Kenyon is a pretty, you know, with it woman. I mean, she has her own career. She works at home. She seems to be very much in charge of her career, dictating the terms of where she works and when she works. And though she is dating a man who is married, she seems okay with it through much of the movie. She certainly doesn't seem as troubled by it and as invested in trying to end the marriage as we often see characters in that situation being. So that doesn't surprise me all that much. I will tell you that neither Dana Andrews nor Henry Fonda wanted to be in this movie. They were both under contract to 20th Century Fox. This was Fonda's last film for Fox, and in fact, I don't think he signed another studio contract after he ended it. I think he didn't like being under contract. He wanted to be able to go to the theater, work in the theater, and choose his own projects and produce his own movies like he would with 12 Angry Men. And he took this movie not because he wanted to play a character who was close to himself, and I've heard similar things about him. I agree, but because he wanted to end his contract, fulfill his obligation, and be done with Fox. I think neither of them was probably looking forward to it because they had heard, I could imagine, that Joan Crawford could be tough to work with. And I could also imagine that these two men who were both accustomed to playing really central roles, if not being the primary star of the movies they had been in, weren't looking forward to playing second fiddle to someone else, and perhaps maybe because it was an actress, or maybe just because it was the title character, and neither of them was going to be the title character. But so I don't know about Henry Fonda's self-awareness, but it certainly didn't come into play here in him taking this part. Lisa.
You said exactly what I was going to say, that neither one was super thrilled about being in this, and I think Preminger almost kind of forgot he made it too. So it's not high on anyone's list and those involved, but luckily we're all enjoying it now, all these years later. But you know, it's interesting. I do think that Peter is moody and withdrawn in this role, but I kind of like Peter. He's very unpredictable. Like you really never know what he's going to say. I feel like the characterization of Peter is just like the other two. extremely spot on with someone who is a very interesting, genial person, but is battling real demons, depression and likely PTSD, likely alcoholism. And it's just a fascinating character, but he's pretty, I don't know, I kind of like his chemistry with Daisy, that very low-key chemistry, but I think he's quite an enjoyable presence. I don't know if I would entirely chalk him up as moody and withholding in this film. I think his performance rewards multiple viewings, I think.
Yeah, and I think that if you think about what Henry Fonda was known for, I mean, he played young Mr. Lincoln, he played Tom Joad. His film, he volunteered to serve, I think, in the Navy during World War II, and before this movie, he'd made My Darling Clementine, where he played a rather upstanding Wyatt Earp. So this sort of character was something of a departure for him. But I honestly think it was just a means to an end from his perspective. We don't have any more hands, but we have a couple of things in the chat I wanted to mention. Rena raises the point that perhaps part of Lucille's unhappiness and frustration and abusive tendencies towards her daughters has to do with some jealousy about the relationship that Dan seems to have with them. I will admit there were elements of Dan's interactions with his daughters, particularly the older one, that I found uncomfortable. I don't know that the movie was trying to suggest anything. I think that's one of those things that we're a lot more sensitive to now than people were 70 or 75 years ago. But that being said, I think he is a little too pleased with how she looks in the dress and in her lipstick. And I think there are other things that made me uncomfortable. And she has enough reason to be resentful of them because Dan constantly undermines her as a parent. But those notes, which Rena picked up on and I observed too, or I sensed as well, I think add another layer to that is very unpleasant to think about. But I think we must be supposed to notice, though I'm not sure. Lisa, did you have any thoughts on that particular area?
It's an interesting area and I guess kind of a dicey one. I hadn't really picked up on any sort of uncomfortable kind of sexuality tinged tensions there. I honestly hadn't. I thought Dan plays the worshipped father figure, and he knows it and he plays into it. But I got the distinct impression that he does love his girls. The moment where he breaks down crying in the court, I think was a really key character moment that felt very earned. But I do think that there is something about the wife's jealousy at how her daughters get such wonderful treatment and she gets such horrible treatment. And again, I want to kind of shout out the wonderful cinematography and the scenes that you get with Dan and his wife and girls in their home. The deep focus of the wife being kind of like all the way down the hall or in a room where Dan is our focus and she's kind of faded in the back, just on totally different visual planes. And it just reinforces her inability to break into his space until the two children are there. Like those are the moments where they're all kind of in the shot together. And I think it's kind of cinematographically that comment about the jealousy over her children is kind of demonstrated as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the cinematography because Leon Shamroy isn't a name that most people know immediately, but he was nominated for more than a dozen Oscars for cinematography. I mean, he's one of the all-time greats. He won for Cleopatra. he won for the 1942 The Black Swan, and he was nominated something like a dozen times. So that deep focus cinematography is the work of a skilled craftsman, particularly in this era, and he does it quite well. And I do think that you make a very good point. And of course, there doesn't have to be an improper relationship or improper thoughts between Dan and his daughters for Lucille to still feel that sort of jealousy, right? She can feel that jealousy even if that isn't there. And in fact, she knows Dan's having an affair. So she's already feeling sort of, undesired. So that could be motivating her as well. A couple more things that came up in the chat having to do with Peter's experiences in the war and his treatment coming back. Barbara and Richard said they didn't feel like he seemed traumatized, but I'm thinking of that scene where we see him sleeping and having the horrible nightmare and the sweating and the twisting and turning, and I mean, something was bothering him, and I don't know why I don't assume it's about Daisy. I assume it's recollections of his wartime experience. Regarding that, that he gets some shabby treatment at the Stork Club, despite being in uniform. Soldiers were not universally treated especially well after the war, and particularly the further away you got from the end of the war. I mean, the best years of our lives is in some ways about that these men made tremendous sacrifices in many cases and didn't seem to be afforded any particular, grace or leniency in many circles when they came home. I mean, I don't think it's anything like Vietnam era soldiers experienced, but it was not any sort of universal appreciation in that moment. I think, and this movie, incorporates that as well. Lisa, any last thoughts before we sign off?
I think this has been a great conversation. I am so glad that I got to force Daisy Kenyon on more people, because it's one I just love talking about and trying to put my finger on what makes it so special. And I think we made a lot of headway in that process. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for suggesting this and for setting us up for this fruitful conversation with your wonderful introduction. And thank you all so much for joining us. We have a number of our remote classroom seminars coming up in May and June on the work of Martin Scorsese on the very influential short film La Jetée, and another in our ongoing series of seminars on short films, this one focusing on short films from Latin America. We will also be, as you know, we are open in the theater showing movies. But if that is not your cup of tea quite yet, you can find more education offerings online. We will soon be returning to education in person. This summer, we will be having some offerings on site, as well as what we're doing online for the remainder of the spring. And you can still find movies that you can only get through theaters like ours online through Theater 5, but we are showing new movies most days of the week. At the Film Institute, we are open for regular business. And of course, we are also open for private rentals that the Glussman so kindly mentioned at the beginning of our discussion. So there are lots of ways to visit BMFI, to get back to seeing movies that you enjoy, the way you enjoy them, and to help support your local nonprofit movie theater. And we'll take your support any way we can get it. We appreciate the memberships of those of you who are members. We appreciate your participation in our programs. And if you have the means to offer some further financial support, we would greatly appreciate that as well. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.